Dear learners, welcome back to the unit number 14 of module 4 of this MOOC. This unit has been named Marginalization, Gender and Intersectionality. In contemporary societies, understanding the complex dynamics of social exclusion, power and identity has become increasingly important. So through this particular video, we will try to explore how marginalization operates across different social categories. We will try to give particular attention to gender and the ways in which multiple forms of oppression intersect. So as learners of this particular course, you must grasp these concepts to contribute meaningfully to creating more equitable society. Through examining theoretical frameworks, real-world case studies, and cultural perspectives, we will develop a nuanced understanding of how social inequalities are produced, maintained, and can be challenged. Let us now try to understand marginalization. Marginalization refers to the social process through which certain individuals or groups are relegated to the edges of society, denied full participation in social, economic, political, and cultural life. Unlike simple exclusion, marginalization is a systematic phenomenon embedded in social structures, institutions, and everyday practices. Marginalized groups face barriers that limit their access to resources, opportunities, decision-making processes, and recognition. This concept encompasses both material deprivation, such as economic poverty, inadequate housing, and limited health care, and symbolic dimension, which include social stigma, misrepresentation in media, and denial of voice in public discourse. Marginalization is not merely about being different. It involves a power relationship where dominant groups establish norms that position others as inferior, deviant, or less worthy. Different forms and mechanisms of marginalization. Marginalization operates through multiple interconnected mechanisms. Economic marginalization. It occurs when groups face systematic barriers to employment, fair wages, property ownership, and economic advancement. This includes discrimination in hiring practices, wage gaps, concentration in precarious or informal work, and limited access to credit and capital. Political marginalization involves exclusion from political participation and decision making. This may take the form of formal disenfranchisement, underrepresentation in government and leadership positions, or more subtle barriers such as lack of political voice, inadequate consultation in policy making, and absence from public debates. Social marginalization manifests through exclusion from social networks, community life, and cultural institutions. Marginalized groups may face social isolation, restricted access to education and healthcare, residential segregation, and limited participation in civic organizations. Cultural marginalization involves the devaluation of certain cultural practices, languages, knowledge systems, and identities. Dominant cultural norms are presented as universal, while the minority cultures are stereotyped, exoticized, or rendered invisible. Now let us have a look at the structural nature of marginalization. Critically, marginalization is structural rather than merely individual. It is built into the organization of social institutions, legal frameworks, economic systems, and cultural beliefs. This structural character means that marginalization persists even without conscious discriminatory intent by individuals. For example, hiring criteria that emphasize culture fit may systematically exclude certain groups, or urban planning decisions may neglect neighborhoods where marginalized communities live. So, understanding marginalization requires recognizing how history shapes present inequalities. Colonial legacies, slavery, caste system, and other historical injustices, they have created enduring patterns of disadvantage that continue to affect the contemporary societies. So these historical processes established hierarchies that become normalized and reproduced across generations. Now let us have a look at gender inequality and social exclusion. Gender as a social construction. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities that societies assign to people based on perceived sex. As we have discussed in the previous lecture, a little bit about intersectionality, this will help you in understanding the present lecture as well. So coming back to what we were discussing, unlike biological sex, gender is learned and varies significantly across cultures and historical periods. Gender systems establish expectations about how women, men, and gender diverse individuals should think, act, or present themselves. So these gender norms are enforced through socialization processes beginning in childhood, institutional practices, and cultural representations. They shape everything from career choices to emotional expression, from household labor division to political leadership opportunities. Importantly, gender is not simply about differences but about hierarchies that most societies have historically organized gender relations in ways that privilege masculinity and subordinate femininity. Gender inequality permeates multiple domains of social life. Economic inequality. Women globally face persistent wage gaps, earning less than men for comparable work. They are overrepresented in low paid sectors such as care work, domestic service, and informal employment. Women also face barriers in reaching leadership positions, the phenomenon which is known as the glass ceiling, and encounter discrimination in entrepreneurship and business ownership. Unpaid care work, predominantly performed by women, remains undervalued and unrecognized in economic calculations. Political underrepresentation. Despite constituting half the world's population, women remain significantly underrepresented in legislative bodies, executive positions, and judicial systems worldwide. This democratic deficit means that women's perspectives and interests are often inadequately represented in policymaking. Barriers include discriminatory political party structures, violence against women in politics, and social norms that question women's leadership capabilities. Educational disparities. While significant progress has been made in girls' education globally, gender gaps still persist, particularly in the secondary and tertiary education in many regions. Moreover, gender stereotypes channel students into different fields of study, with women underrepresented in STEM. STEM means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So they are underrepresented in STEM fields and men in care professions such as nursing, etc. Violence and safety. Gender based violence, including domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment, and harmful traditional practices, represent a severe form of gender inequality. Such violence restricts women's mobility, economic participation, and overall freedom while being inadequately addressed by justice systems. Health inequalities. Gender shapes health outcomes through differential access to healthcare, gender specific health needs that may be neglected, and the ways social determinants of health operate differently for different genders. Patriarchy and gender norms. The term patriarchy describes social systems in which men hold primary power and predominate in roles of political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. Patriarchal structures are maintained through institutions such as family, religion, law, economy, and ideologies such as beliefs about natural gender differences, proper gender roles, masculine superiority, etc. So, gender norms, the rules and expectations that appropriate behaviors at different genders, they constrain both men and women, though typically in asymmetric ways. While women face restrictions on their autonomy, mobility, and ambition, men also experience pressures to conform to ideals of masculinity, that may be harmful, such as suppressing emotions, avoiding caregiving roles, and demonstrating dominance. Challenging gender inequality requires transforming these deeply embedded norms and structures, not simply providing women with equal opportunities within the existing systems. Let us have a theoretical understanding of this particular issue through the theory of intersectionality. Intersectionality, a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, provides a framework for understanding how multiple social identities intersect to create unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. Crenshaw developed this concept while analyzing how black women in the United States of America faced discrimination that was neither solely about race nor solely about gender, but about the specific intersection of being both black and female. The core insight of intersectionality is that social categories such as race, culture, gender, sexuality, disability, caste, religion, and nationality do not operate independently. Instead, they interact to produce distinct experiences that cannot be understood by examining each category in isolation. A black woman's experience of sexism differs from a white woman's experience. A working class woman's experience differs from an upper class woman's experience. Intersecting systems of oppression. Intersectionality recognizes that systems of oppression such as racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, and others, they are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. These systems work together to create complex patterns of advantage and disadvantage. For instance, labor market discrimination may reflect both gender and racial bias simultaneously. Stereotypes about certain groups combine racial and gender assumptions, such as the mammy stereotype of black women or the dragon lady stereotype of Asian women. Immigration policies may differently impact women and men from particular racial or religious backgrounds. The intersectional perspective reveals that marginalization is not addictive. Gender discrimination plus racial discrimination, but multiplicative, creating qualitatively different experiences. Being at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities often means facing unique forms of discrimination that are invisible when social categories are analyzed separately. So, intersectionality also illuminates how privilege operates. Individuals hold multiple identities simultaneously, some conferring privilege and others conferring disadvantage. A wealthy white woman may experience gender discrimination while benefiting from race and class privilege. A poor white man may face class disadvantage while benefiting from white privilege and male privilege. So, understanding one's own positionality, that means the social location one occupies based on intersecting identities, it is crucial for recognizing how power operates. So, this awareness helps avoid generalizations that treat all women, all racial minorities, and all working class people as having identical experiences. Now, let us look at the applications and implications. Intersectionality has profound implications for activism, policymaking, and research. It demands anti-discrimination policies address multiple intersecting forms of bias rather than treating categories separately. Social movements build coalitions that recognize diverse experiences within broad identity categories. Research designs account for within group diversity rather than assuming homogeneity. Institutional practices examine how different groups experience the same policies differently. Critics have debated whether intersectionality focuses too heavily on identity at the expense of structural analysis or whether it becomes unwieldy when considering numerous intersecting categories. However, intersectionality remains a vital tool for understanding complex patterns of inequality in contemporary societies. Let us have a look at a few case studies. The first being Dalit women in India. Dalit women in India experience intersecting marginalization based on caste, gender, and often class. The caste system, despite legal prohibition of untouchability, continues to structure social relations in significant ways. Dalit communities, which were formerly called untouchables, they face social exclusion, economic discrimination, and violence. Dalit women face a double burden. As Dalits, they experience caste discrimination, segregation in housing and public spaces, and limited economic opportunities. Again, as women, they face patriarchal control, restrictions on mobility, and gender based violence. At the intersection, they face specific forms of oppression, including disproportionate rates of sexual violence, which is often used as a tool to assert caste dominance. They are overrepresented in the most stigmatized and lowest paid occupations, such as manual scavenging. When addressing gender inequality in India, upper caste feminist movements have sometimes overlooked caste, while Dalit right movements have sometimes marginalized gender issues. An intersectional approach recognizes Dalit women's unique experiences and ensures their voices and leaderships in movements for social change. If we look at the LGBTQ plus refugees case, LGBTQ plus individuals seeking refuge status face intersecting vulnerabilities based on sexuality or gender identity, migration status, and often race, class, or religion. In countries where homosexuality is criminalized or where gender diverse individuals face persecution, LGBTQ plus people may flee seeking safety. However, refugee determination systems may not adequately recognize claims based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Asylum seekers must often prove their LGBTQ plus identity in ways that are intrusive and rely on stereotypes. In refugee camps or detention centers, LGBTQ plus individuals frequently face harassment, violence, and isolation from other refugees. They may also encounter discrimination in resettlement countries, compounding their marginalization. This case illustrates how intersection or intersecting identities create unique vulnerabilities that require tailored policy responses and support systems which are sensitive to multiple intersecting dimensions of marginalization. If we look at the case of indigenous women and environmental justice, indigenous women globally face intersecting marginalization based on indigeneity, gender, and often geography. That means if they are living in the remote or rural areas, they are simultaneously affected by colonization and dispossession of indigenous people and by gender hierarchies within both indigenous communities and dominant societies. In environmental conflicts such as mining projects, deforestation, or water right disputes, indigenous women are disproportionately affected. They often have specific roles in subsistence economies and bear primary responsibility for water collection, food production, and natural resource management. Environmental degradation, therefore, directly impacts their ability to fulfill these roles. Moreover, resource extraction projects are associated with increased violence against indigenous women, including sexual violence by workers in extractive industries. Yet, indigenous women are also leaders in environmental movements. If we look at the Chipko movement, for example, they draw on traditional ecological knowledge and organize resistance to destructive projects. An intersectional analysis reveals both their specific vulnerabilities and their agency and leadership in struggles for environmental and social justice. Now, let us have a look at the cultural perspectives on marginalization and gender. Diverse cultural constructions of gender. Gender systems vary significantly across cultures. While gender inequality exists globally, its specific forms, intensity, and the cultural logics justifying it differs. Some cultures recognize more than two gender, such as the Hijra community in South Asia, two-spirit people among indigenous North Americans, or Fa'afani in Samoa. They challenge the Western binary gender framework. So understanding these diverse gender systems is crucial for avoiding cultural imperialism, the imposition of one's culture's norms as universal standards. However, cultural relativism is the view that cultural practices should not be judged by external standards. They possess challenges when cultural traditions involve harmful practices. Navigating between these positions requires dialogue, respect for local knowledge and agency, and attention to internal debates within communities about their own practices. So, what role does religion play in this entire system? Religious traditions significantly shape gender relations, though their interpretations may vary widely. Patriarchal interpretations of religious texts have historically justified gender inequality. They restrict women's religious authority, educational opportunities, and public participation. However, feminist theologians and religious reformers across traditions have challenged these interpretations, recovering egalitarian stance within religious texts and traditions. In some contexts, religion provides resources for women empowerment and resistance to secular form of oppression. In others, religious fundamentalism intensifies gender oppression. The relationship between religion and gender is thus very complex and contested, varying across traditions, denominations, and local contexts. Now we'll have a look at the globalization and cultural change. Globalization, which is an increasing interconnectedness of societies through economic integration, communication technologies, and cultural exchange, has complex effects on gender relations and marginalization. On one hand, global human rights frameworks, transnational feminist movements, and exposure to diverse gender practices can challenge local hierarchies and support women's rights. On the other hand, global economic restructuring may intensify inequalities as when structural adjustment policies cut social services that women rely on, or when global supply chains exploit women workers in export processing zones. Cultural globalization can also provoke backlash in the form of traditionalist movements that seek to reassert patriarchal gender norms as markers of cultural authenticity. Cultural resistance and social movements. Marginalized groups have long resisted oppression through cultural expressions, including music, art, literature, and performance. These cultural forms serve multiple functions, documenting experiences of marginalization, building solidarity and collective identity, challenging dominant representation, and imagining alternative futures. Contemporary social movements combating marginalization and gender inequality often operate transnationally while remaining rooted in local contexts. Movements such as #MeToo, #Black Lives Matter, and indigenous rights movements, they demonstrate how local struggles connect to global patterns of injustice. They employ intersectional frameworks to build broad coalitions while respecting diverse experiences and priorities. So, in conclusion, marginalization, gender inequality, and intersectionality are fundamental concepts for understanding contemporary social realities. Marginalization operates through economic, political, social, and cultural mechanisms that systematically disadvantage certain groups. Gender inequality manifests across multiple domains rooted in patriarchal structures and restrictive gender norms. Intersectionality provides a crucial framework for analyzing how multiple forms of marginalization intersect to produce unique experiences that cannot be understood through single category analysis. The case studies and cultural perspectives examined in this particular video, they demonstrate the complexity and diversity of these phenomena across different contexts. They reveal both the common patterns in how power operates and the specificity of local experiences. As learners of this particular course, developing this understanding is not merely an academic exercise but a foundation for ethical citizenship and professional practice. So, addressing Marginalization and inequality requires structural transformation, changes in institutions, policies, cultural beliefs, and power relations. It demands that those with privilege use it to challenge systems of oppression while respecting the agency and leadership of marginalized communities themselves. As emerging professionals and citizens, your generation has both the responsibility and the opportunity to contribute to building more inclusive, equitable, and just societies. I hope so far you have understood these particular concepts, and these will help you in analyzing or understanding whatever you face as citizens in this particular society. Thank you, and we will meet in the next video.